The snow came in sideways that Tuesday night, driving hard off Lake Michigan with the kind of cold that had teeth. Chicago in January was not a city that apologized for itself. It pressed down on you, stripped you bare, reminded you exactly how small you were against the geometry of glass towers and frozen wind corridors. Ethan Cole had learned to love it. Not the cold exactly, no one loved the cold, but the emptiness it created. By 9 o'clock on a night like this, the 42nd floor of Hale and Merritt Capital was as quiet as a held breath. The open-plan trading floor, usually a pressure cooker of voices and chairs rolling and keyboards clicking, had gone still. The overhead lights had dimmed to their after-hours setting. The only sounds were the groan of the building settling in the wind and the faint mechanical exhale of the HVAC system that Ethan was currently lying underneath, his back flat against the cold tile, a flashlight clenched between his teeth. The secondary return duct on the east side of the floor had been pulling warm air instead of circulating it. Small problem. Invisible problem. The kind of problem that nobody noticed until the thermostat crept up 2 degrees and someone in a $7,000 suit got uncomfortable. That was his job. Finding the invisible problems before anyone had to notice them. He worked with the slow, deliberate economy of someone who had learned that rushing things cost more than time. 41 years old, broad through the shoulders from years of physical work, with a face that had settled into something quiet and self-contained. Not unfriendly people sometimes mistook it for unfriendly but contained. Like a house with the curtains drawn. Everything going on inside, nothing leaking out. His uniform was slate gray, the same color as the duct housing, and he wore it like a second skin. 3 years at Hale and Merritt Capital, the private equity firm that occupied floors 38 through 42 of this particular tower on Wacker Drive, and Ethan had cultivated a specific, practiced invisibility. He arrived before most people. He left after most people. When he passed through a room, he moved along the walls, close to the architecture, like he was part of the building's own circulatory system. This was not an accident. This was survival. He had Lily to think about. 4 years old, all dark eyelashes and serious questions, currently asleep in their apartment in Pilsen, in a bed shaped like a race car that he'd found on Craigslist and repainted yellow because she'd said yellow was the happiest color. Margaret Holt from 3B was sitting with her tonight, as she did on his late shifts, a retired schoolteacher with patient hands and a bottomless supply of herbal tea who asked for nothing in return except the occasional jar of the pasta sauce he made on Sundays. He thought about Lily now as he worked. The particular weight of her when she climbed into his lap, the way she smelled like baby shampoo even though she was too old for it because she'd declared it her favorite, and he wasn't going to argue. He thought about how she'd looked when he'd left tonight, her face slack in sleep, one arm thrown over the edge of the mattress like she was reaching for something. He thought, I cannot afford a single mistake. Not financial mistakes, though, those two. He meant the other kind. The kind where a man like him started blurring lines that didn't exist to be blurred. Lines between floors. Lines between job titles. Lines between a woman like Victoria Hale and a man like Ethan Cole. He was deep in the duct housing, adjusting the damper actuator, when he heard her heels on the tile. He knew them before he saw her. He knew the rhythm of them, purposeful, slightly impatient. The sound of a person who moved through space as though it had been arranged specifically for them, which, at Hale and Merritt Capital, it largely had been. Victoria Hale, 44 years old, co-founder, managing director. The Hale in the firm's name. She had the kind of face that made you want to study it. Strong jaw, dark eyes that were always slightly narrowed as though she was running calculations, dark hair pulled back with an efficiency that suggested she'd stopped caring about how it looked, and somehow this had made it look better. She wore her authority the way other women wore jewelry lightly, as though she'd had it so long she forgot it was there. She stopped about 12 feet from where he was lying on the floor. He felt the change in the room, the way you feel a weather shift, a slight pressure differential, an awareness. He kept working. The actuator, she said. He hadn't expected her to know the word. He pulled himself out from under the duct housing and sat up, not quite standing, and looked at the floor beside her feet. Yes, ma'am. Secondary return on the east side. Should be resolved in about 20 minutes. I wasn't asking for a timeline. He paused. Understood. There was a silence. She didn't leave. Why won't you look at me? The question landed in the quiet room and didn't dissipate. It just sat there, waiting. Ethan kept his gaze on the floor beside her shoes. Good shoes. The kind that cost more than a month of his rent. Just focused on the work, ma'am. You've been on this floor dozens of times. Her voice wasn't unkind. It was precise. You've never once looked at me directly. I've noticed. That was the problem with people like her. They noticed. I'm just the maintenance tech, he said carefully. That's not what I asked. He stood up then, because staying on the floor felt suddenly wrong, and he redirected his gaze to the middle distance, the glass wall beyond her. The snowstorm pressing itself against the city, the orange-white glow of Chicago at night. He could feel her looking at him, the way you feel a hand near a flame. I should get back to this, he said. She was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then, of course, he heard her heels move away. He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding, and he thought, good, keep it that way. He slid back under the duct housing. His hands, which had been perfectly steady all evening, had developed the faintest tremor. He noticed this with calm, clinical detachment. Then he focused on the actuator and willed himself back into invisibility. The apartment on South Paulina Street was 340 square feet if you were being generous and didn't count the bathroom, which Ethan had renovated himself over the course of 6 weekends 2 years ago, retiling the floor and regrouting the tub so that it felt less like a place that was barely surviving and more like a place that had been cared for. He was good at that. Taking something that had been neglected and making it functional again, making it decent. His own father had been a plumber who treated every pipe in every house as though it deserved his full attention, and Ethan had inherited this, not the plumbing specifically, but the philosophy behind it. Things broke. You fixed them. You did it right, or you did it again. He got home at 11:45. The snow was still coming down, muffling the city, and Pilsen was quiet in that particular winter night way, the street lamps casting circles of light in the white. He took the stairs instead of the elevator because the elevator in his building had a rattle he didn't trust, and when he pushed open the door to 2A, the smell of chamomile hit him first. Margaret Holt was asleep on the couch with a mystery novel open on her chest, her reading glasses still on, the small lamp creating a pool of amber light. She looked the way she always looked when he came home, like evidence that the world still contained gentle people. He touched her shoulder lightly. Margaret. She woke without startlement, the talent of someone who'd spent 30 years waking to school bells. She went down at 8:30, she said. Had 4 questions about whether whales dream. Did you have an answer? I told her, scientists think maybe yes. She was gathering herself up, her novel, her glasses case. She said that seemed right because water probably gave you good dreams. Margaret smiled at her shoes. She's something else, Ethan. I know. After Margaret left, he stood in the doorway of Lily's room for a moment. The race car bed with its yellow paint, slightly chipped now from a year of use. The stuffed elephant named Gerald, who had lost an eye and been lovingly repaired with a button. The glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling that he'd put up on a Sunday afternoon. Both of them lying on their backs on her floor, pressing stars to the ceiling until they ran out. Lily was on her side, one hand open near her face, Gerald tucked under her arm. Ethan thought about her mother sometimes, not with bitterness anymore, because bitterness required energy he didn't have, but with a kind of flat, factual sorrow. Rebecca had been 27 when Lily was born, and she'd stayed 6 weeks, long enough to determine that this was not, after all, the life she wanted. Long enough to leave a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I'm sorry. I know this makes me a terrible person. You'll both be better without me." He hadn't heard from her in 4 years. He didn't know if she was right about the better without her part. He suspected the question was irrelevant. He had what he had, which was this apartment, this child, and the specific shape of a life built around one priority. He ate leftover soup, standing at the counter, watching the snow fall past the window. His phone had a text from his friend Marcus, who worked in building services 2 towers down. "Heard you're working the 42nd floor now." "That's the Hale woman's floor, yeah? How's that going?" Ethan stared at the message for a moment, then put his phone face down on the counter. "Fine," he typed, eventually. He washed his bowl. He checked the lock on the door. He lay down on his side of the double bed. He still slept on one side. 4 years later. The left side. For no reason he could explain, and listened to the city under snow. "Routine," he'd said. He thought about the way she'd said, "Why won't you look at me?" Not angrily, not playfully, with something that sounded almost like genuine curiosity, like it was a problem she was actually trying to solve. He closed his eyes. He thought about Lily asking whether whales dream. He let that carry him to sleep instead. It started, or escalated, he wasn't sure which was the right word, the following Thursday. He was replacing a ballast in one of the corridor light fixtures outside the 41st floor conference rooms. Standard work, mid-morning, most of the floor occupied with their usual controlled intensity of important financial activity. He was on the stepladder, focused on the wiring, when he heard her voice below him. "Ethan, not maintenance, not Hay." His name. He came down 1 step on the ladder and looked to his left, because looking directly down would have meant looking directly at her. And old habits. Victoria Hale was standing in the corridor with 2 senior associates. He recognized Franklin Marsh, who had the humorless competence of a man born to manage other people's money, and a newer one, a woman named Brianna Caldwell, who'd been with the firm maybe 8 months and still had some life behind her eyes. Both of them were looking at Ethan with the particular expression of people who had not previously registered that he had a name. "The ballast?" Victoria said, nodding upward. "Yes, ma'am." The fluorescent flicker in the 3rd conference room. He kept his voice level, professional. "This should resolve it." "Good." She paused. "You've been with the building 3 years. It wasn't a question." He said nothing. "And you've never looked at me directly once in that time. Not at me, not at anyone above associate level. I've been paying attention." She didn't say this like it was a complaint. She said it like she was reading aloud from a document, stating facts. "Why is that?" Franklin Marsh had his phone out and was suddenly very interested in his phone. Brianna Caldwell was watching with the barely suppressed attention of someone watching something they will absolutely discuss later. Ethan said, "I'm not sure that's relevant to my work." "Probably not," Victoria agreed. She looked at him for another 3 seconds, calmly, the way she probably looked at balance sheets searching for the thing that didn't add up. Then she nodded once and moved on down the corridor, the 2 associates falling into step behind her. Franklin Marsh glanced back at Ethan as he walked away. His expression was unreadable, but not hostile. More like, that was unusual. Ethan climbed back up the ladder. His hands were steady. He was fine. He finished the job in 12 minutes, packed his tools with the same deliberate efficiency as always, and took the service elevator down to the maintenance floor. He sat on the bench in the break room, which was empty, and drank a cup of coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long, and stared at the institutional gray wall in front of him. She knew his name, which meant she had looked it up, which meant that after Tuesday night, she had thought about him enough to go to HR or building management and find out the name of the maintenance technician who wouldn't look at her. This was worse than the question itself. He could handle a question. Questions ended. You gave an answer or you didn't, and then the conversation moved on and both parties returned to their appropriate distances. But a person who looked you up. A person who used your name in a hallway in front of colleagues. Deliberately, not casually, with the specific intention of making you real. That was different. He thought about Marcus's text. "How's that going?" He got out his phone and typed, "Routine is getting complicated." Marcus texted back a single emoji, a snowflake, which was probably meant to be funny. Ethan didn't find it funny. He also didn't find it entirely wrong. 2 weeks later, another evening shift. The building was near empty again. A Friday with a winter storm warning, most of the professional class having had the good sense to clear out by 6. The snow this time was quieter, not the driving sideways kind, but a dense, purposeful vertical fall, the kind that accumulated on ledges and window frames, and made the city look like it was being slowly wrapped in gauze. Ethan was on 42, replacing a faulty motion sensor in the east corridor. Purely mechanical work, the kind his hands could do without his full attention. Which was perhaps why he heard her when she came out of her office at 8:15 and found him there. Victoria Hale stopped, looked at him, looked at the motion sensor. "Still here," she said. Not accusatory, just noting it. Almost done. She had her jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, which meant she'd been at her desk for hours. There was a pen tucked behind her ear that she didn't seem aware of. He noted these things without looking directly at her peripheral attention was something he'd developed into an art form. She said, "There's no one else on this floor." "No, ma'am. You don't have to call me ma'am when there's no one else on the floor." He said nothing. She moved to the window at the end of the corridor, floor to ceiling, looking out over the river and the grid of lights going white under snow, and stood there with her arms crossed, not like someone who'd come to look at the view, but like someone who needed a moment to think. He kept working. After a while, she said, "What would happen if you looked at me?" He'd been expecting something, but not exactly that. He kept his hands moving on the sensor housing. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Yes, you are." A pause. The snow fell outside the glass. The building sighed around them. "Nothing good," he said. "For anyone." She turned from the window then, and he had nowhere to put his eyes except the middle distance, and the middle distance happened to contain her reflection in the dark glass behind her, which was not quite looking at her. Technically, and he could see her expression, which was not what he expected. Not frustrated, not pleased with herself. Something quieter than either of those things. "Who told you that?" she asked. "Nobody had to. The gap in job titles," she said. "Among other things." "What other things?" He finished with the sensor, clipped the housing back into place, gathered his tools. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 4. Her mother left when she was 6 weeks old. My entire life is organized around making sure she has stability." He kept his voice even, informational. "I cannot afford to be the story that goes around. I cannot afford for anything to happen that puts my job at risk. I cannot afford to be a complication in anyone's life, especially." He stopped. "Especially mine," she said. "I wasn't going to say that, but that's what you meant." He finally looked at her. Not at her reflection. At her, directly. For the first time in 3 years. It lasted about 2 seconds. He looked away. "You have a daughter," she said, and something in her voice had shifted slightly, like a key changing. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I see you. That's the problem." He picked up his bag. He said, very carefully, "Good night, Victoria," and he walked to the service elevator and pressed the button and waited with his back to the corridor, and he heard, just barely, her exhale behind him, something between a breath and a word that didn't form. The elevator came. He got in. He pressed basement. He stood with his eyes closed all the way down. Saturday, his day off. Lily woke him at 6:58 by climbing onto his chest and placing her hands on either side of his face in the specific way she had of demanding his full consciousness. "Daddy, Daddy." "It snowed." "I know. There's so much snow." "I know. Can we make a person in the snow?" "A snowman. A snow person," she corrected. with the dignity of someone who had given this thought. Gerald wants to come. Gerald, the one-eyed elephant, did, in fact, come. Ethan dressed them both in approximately 7 layers each, Lily refusing the red mittens in favor of the blue ones, though the blue ones were a size too small, and they went to the small park at the end of their block and built a snow person of considerable ambition and limited technical quality. Lily gave it a carrot nose and 2 rocks for eyes and a scarf that was actually one of Ethan's old ones, and she stood back and regarded it with her hands on her hips in a posture that was entirely her own. "What should we call her?" she asked. "She's a she? Obviously. You name her." Lily thought about this with great seriousness. "Margaret," she said. "Like upstairs, Margaret, but a snow one." Ethan crouched down beside her, both of them looking at the snow person. Margaret would be honored. They went home and made hot chocolate with the little marshmallows, and Lily sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a blue crayon, drawing something she refused to show him until it was finished. He made eggs. He put on the playlist she liked, which was mostly folk music from the 1970s that she had developed an inexplicable attachment to, possibly through Margaret's influence. The apartment smelled like eggs and chocolate and whatever the particular warmth of a small child's contentment smelled like. He stood at the stove and thought, "This is the whole world. This is everything." Then, without deciding to, he thought about a woman standing at a glass wall 42 floors up, looking at falling snow with her arms crossed and a pen behind her ear. He flipped the eggs. "Daddy," Lily said, "do important people work in your building?" He looked over at her. She was still coloring, not looking at him, the blue crayon moving in careful circles. "Some important people? Yeah. What makes them important?" He thought about this seriously, because she asked seriously and she deserved serious answers. "They make decisions that affect a lot of other people," he said. "Like you? Make decisions for me? Different scale, but the same kind of important?" He slid the eggs onto the plate. "You know what? Yeah. The same kind." She considered this, then held up her drawing. It was a building, a rectangle with many small squares for windows, and at the very top, a figure in gray that he recognized as himself, and tiny snowflakes all around. "That's you," she said, "being important in your building." He looked at the drawing for a moment too long. "Thank you, Bug," he said. She went back to coloring. He set the plate in front of her. He did not allow himself to think about dark eyes running calculations. He did not allow himself to think about the way a voice sounded when it said, "I see you," like it was a discovery and a problem simultaneously. He sat across from his daughter and watched her eat eggs and move a blue crayon and sing quietly to herself, and he thought about nothing else. He was mostly successful. It was the kind of thing that could only happen in the particular way that life occasionally arranged its coincidences with a total lack of subtlety. 3rd week of January. Ethan was taking the maintenance elevator between floors when he got the dispatch call. Elevator 3 on 42 was stuck between floors with one occupant. He took the stairs the rest of the way up, pried open the mechanical room access panel, and assessed the situation. The hydraulic had a pressure drop he could get the car moving manually, but it would take 15 minutes and the car would need to be held at the 42nd floor landing rather than traveling. He called up through the emergency intercom. "Building maintenance. I'm going to have you moving in about 15 minutes. Are you all right in there?" A pause. Then, "I'm fine." He recognized the voice. Of course he did. He worked steadily, without rush panic, didn't fix hydraulics, and 17 minutes later, the elevator car settled level with the floor and the doors opened. Victoria Hale stepped out with the composure of someone who had decided some time earlier that composure was simply a choice she made, regardless of circumstances. She looked at him. He was on one knee beside the access panel, his tools around him. He looked back. "Hydraulic pressure drop," he said. "The car is out of service for tonight. I'll have a repair crew here tomorrow morning." "All right." She looked at the elevator behind her, then back at him. Neither of them moved. That's what I'm here for. Is it? The hallway was empty. It was nearly 9 o'clock. The city hummed 42 floors below them in the dark. I got stuck in an elevator when I was 7, she said, conversationally, like she was talking to herself as much as him. In my father's office building. 20 minutes. I was terrified. Were you terrified tonight? No. A pause. I don't know why not. He stood, started gathering his tools. Maybe you just got used to it. Or maybe I had other things on my mind. She sat down, not in a chair. There were no chairs in the corridor, but on the floor, with her back against the wall, with a calm matter-of-factness that surprised him. She looked up at him. Sit down, Ethan. He looked at the floor beside her. He looked at his tools. He thought about every reason in the world why this was a bad idea. He sat down. They sat with their backs against the wall of the 42nd floor. The city spread out through the glass opposite them, snowfall catching the light. Tell me about her, Victoria said. Your daughter. He thought about deflecting. He looked at the city. He said, her name is Lily. She's 4. She named a snowman Margaret today after our neighbor. She has a stuffed elephant named Gerald who lost an eye and she made me sew a button on. He paused. She asked me this morning if important people worked in my building. What did you tell her? That some did. And yourself? He was quiet for a moment. I told her decisions that affect a lot of people make you important. And she showed me a drawing of me at the top of the building. Victoria said nothing for a moment. Then, very quietly, that's a better definition of important than the one I was raised with. He looked at her then, not glancing away, not peripheral, but actually looked. Her profile, the lines of her face, the way she held her jaw slightly tense even when she was sitting on the floor of a corridor at 9 o'clock at night, like she was always on guard against something. What were you raised with? He asked. Revenue, she said. Assets under management. Market position. She paused. My father built this firm. I took it over when I was 38 and made it twice as large. That's what important meant. And now? She turned to look at him. They were close, not inappropriately close, but close enough that he could see the particular dark brown of her eyes, which were not running calculations at this particular moment. They were just looking at him, plainly. Now, I'm not sure, she said. The story was already moving by the time Ethan heard about it from Marcus. People talking on 42, the text said. You and the boss. Heard you sat in the hallway with her for like an hour. 20 minutes, actually. But he understood how these things expanded. He texted back. We talked after an elevator repair. That's it. Marcus. Yeah, but that's not how it's going to sound, is it? He knew Marcus was right. He'd known it before he sat down on that corridor floor. He'd known it was a mistake the moment he felt himself not standing back up. It crystallized over the following week in small, specific ways. The security supervisor, a thick-necked man named Dale Crawford who'd been in the building longer than Ethan, found a reason to stop by the maintenance floor and deliver what he probably thought was a friendly warning. Hey, just want to say the executive floors are sensitive. People notice things. Especially with the firm in the middle of a partner vote. He paused, letting that land. Just keep your head down, yeah? Ethan thanked him, but he stood in the break room after Dale left and felt something shift inside him. A slow, building pressure like the hydraulic working in reverse. He thought about what it meant that his normal, professional behavior had become something that required a warning. He thought about the fact that he had, genuinely, done nothing wrong, that he'd sat in a corridor and had a 20-minute conversation about a child's snowman and a man's definition of importance, and that this was apparently enough for people to build stories around. He thought, this is what I was protecting against. But beneath that, a smaller voice. She said, I see you. He called Margaret that evening, standing outside in the cold because Lily was doing her bath. The phone pressed to his ear. He didn't tell Margaret about Victoria. He told her he was having a hard time at work, which was true in a way that felt insufficient. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what I tell my kids, the ones who were always trying to be invisible? I told them, invisible is just another word for lonely." He stood in the cold for a long time after hanging up. Then he went inside and helped Lily rinse the shampoo out of her hair, and she said, "Daddy, what's your favorite thing about winter?" And he said, "Right now, this," which was true. The next morning, he got to work early. He had 4 routine jobs on 38 and 39. He did them efficiently, professionally, and he did not go to 42. He went home. He took the bus because the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees, and the walk would have taken 25 minutes. And he was tired in the specific way of a man who had been bracing against something all day. He sat near the back and watched the city scroll past the fogged window, corner stores and taqueries, and the yellow signs of laundromats, the ordinary human infrastructure of a neighborhood that asked nothing of him except to exist in it. He had always loved Pilsen for this. It didn't perform. It just was. He cooked pasta. Lily had been at the neighbors again. Margaret had taken her to a children's museum exhibit about ocean creatures, which Lily had discussed at extended length through dinner. She had questions about octopuses that Ethan answered as honestly as he could, and then supplemented with internet research on Margaret's tablet. By 8 o'clock, she was asleep with a library book about the deep sea open on her pillow, her breathing slow and regular. He stood in her doorway longer than usual. He thought, for the first time in a long time, that his life felt too small, not in the way it had before Lily, which had been an aching, directionless smallness, but in a different way. Like a coat he'd bought for a specific kind of weather that was now the wrong fit for the season he was in. He went to find her. This was the part of the story he hadn't been able to write in his head ahead of time, because it required him to be a different person than the one he'd spent 4 years, becoming not a worse person, but a braver one, which was sometimes the same thing and sometimes not. He requested access to the 42nd floor through official channels for a routine inspection of the ventilation intake, which was not false. The intake did need a quarterly check. He just happened to schedule it on a Tuesday morning when, according to the building calendar, Victoria Hale had no meetings until 11. She was at her desk. The office was glass-walled, facing the lake, which on this February morning was a flat sheet of cold mercury under an overcast sky. She looked up when he knocked on the open door. "Ventilation intake check," he said. "I'll be quick. It's in the ceiling panel behind you," she said. "I know where it is." He went to the panel. He opened it. He inspected it. His hands were steady. This time, he intended them to be. After 2 minutes, he said, without turning around, "I've been thinking about what you said." "About seeing me." She was quiet. "I've spent 3 years trying not to exist on these floors any more than I had to," he said, "because I couldn't afford the complication. But I've been doing some arithmetic." He closed the panel. He turned around. He looked directly at her. "The complication is already there. It was there from the first night you asked me the question. Me keeping my head down isn't going to undo that." Victoria put down her pen. She looked at him with the same expression she'd had on the corridor floor, not calculating, just present. "What are you saying?" she said. "People like me don't belong in your world," he said. "That's true. I'm not pretending it isn't. Our entire situation is set up in a way that makes this," he gestured between them, slightly awkwardly, a problem with a clear downside. She waited. "But I think your world might be broken," he said. "And I think mine might be smaller than it needs to be." She was quiet for a long moment. "You have a daughter," she said. "That doesn't scare you off?" "No." He paused. "Does it scare you?" She looked out the window at the gray lake, then back at him. "I don't know yet," she said, honestly. "I haven't had enough information." He almost smiled. "That seems fair. Are you asking me something, Ethan?" "I'm asking if you want to have dinner," he said. "Not here. Not in a place with tablecloths. Somewhere normal. where I can look at you properly for more than 30 seconds at a time." She looked at him for a long moment. A real look, the kind that assessed and accepted simultaneously. "Friday," she said. 7 o'clock. "You pick." He picked the Vietnamese place on North Milwaukee that he and Marcus went to sometimes, which had red plastic stools and a fish tank near the door, and served the best pho he'd had outside of a Vietnamese household, and which cost $14 a bowl. He told himself this was a test of some kind. He arrived 7 minutes early and sat at a table in the back and watched the door. The restaurant was half full, warm and steaming with the smell of star anise and bone broth, and 2 elderly men at the table nearest him were playing a card game with the unhurried ease of people who had been playing it for decades. She came in 2 minutes late in dark jeans and a coat he didn't recognize as expensive until later, and she stood in the doorway looking around the room with an expression that was not disdainful and not performatively comfortable. Just genuinely oriented, taking in the place. She found him. She came and sat down. "I like it," she said. "You haven't tried the food yet." "I like the fish tank." They ordered. The awkwardness he'd been anticipating, the chasm of context and class and all of it, the thing he'd been afraid would make the evening feel like a mistake, did materialize, briefly, in the first 10 minutes, and then something happened that he hadn't predicted. She asked about Lily, and he started talking, and the awkwardness dissolved the way ice dissolves in something warm, gradually and then completely. He told her about the snow person named Margaret. He told her about Gerald, the elephant, and the button eye, the way Lily had watched him sew it with her hands clasped in her lap, the gravity of the occasion. He told her about the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. Victoria listened in a way that people rarely listened fully. Without planning her response, her eyes on him, her pho getting slightly cold. "She sounds like a person," she said. "Not like a child. Like an actual, specific person." "She is," he said. "She's more of a person than most people. How do you do it alone?" He thought about the question seriously. "You stop thinking of it as alone," he said. "You think of it as, this is the team. 2 people. We figure it out." He paused. "Margaret helps. Marcus helps. Lily helps, actually. She makes it make sense." Victoria wrapped her hands around her tea glass. "My father worked 16-hour days every day of my childhood," she said. "He built something extraordinary. He also missed every school play, every graduation, every she stopped. He was proud of me. I know he was. He just showed it by making me his successor." She was quiet for a moment. "I sometimes wonder what I missed by being his daughter instead of someone else's." He didn't say anything. He let that sit. "I'm sorry," she said. "That was more than you asked for." "No," he said. "It wasn't." They sat with the ambient noise of the restaurant around them. Voices, the clatter of chopsticks. A child at a nearby table loudly identifying things and the snow falling again outside the window, which it had been doing intermittently all week, and Ethan thought about 2 worlds and whether they were actually separate things or just different rooms in the same large house. She looked up from her tea. In the warm light of the restaurant, without the precision of her professional setting, she looked tired, he thought. Not defeated, just the kind of tired that came from years of being excellent at things that didn't quite add up to what you needed. "You're looking at me," she said. "I know," he said. "Finally," she said, and she smiled, not the controlled expression he'd seen on the 42nd floor, but a real one, slightly crooked, surprised at itself. He looked at that smile for a moment longer than was strictly neutral. "There it is," he said quietly. She raised an eyebrow. "The person under the managing director," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Same goes," she said. March, then April. Then the particular golden inflection of a Chicago May, when the city collectively exhaled and the lake turned blue again, and everyone emerged from their winter shells, blinking and grateful. They moved slowly. There was a deliberateness to it that felt earned, not cautious in a fearful way, but careful in the way that two people are careful when they understand the stakes and have decided those stakes are worth it. His shift on the 42nd floor had been reassigned after a quiet conversation between building management and HR, which removed the professional complexity without anyone having to make it dramatic. He worked 38 and 39. He was fine with 38 and 39. His supervisor, a measured man named Ron Garrett, who communicated in practical sentences and never once asked a personal question, had simply handed him a new floor schedule and said, "Suits your route better anyway." Ethan had thanked him and meant it. He also had a conversation with Dale Crawford, the security supervisor, in which he said nothing defensive and nothing apologetic. Simply, "I understand you had concerns. I don't think there'll be concerns going forward." Dale had looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once, and that had been that. Ethan had walked away understanding something he'd known abstractly, but now knew in his body. The people who put walls up to keep you small were rarely prepared for the version of you that simply walked around them. The firm's partner vote came and went, and Victoria's position was secured on its merits, which had never genuinely been in question because she was, by any measure, extraordinary at her work, a fact that had nothing to do with a maintenance technician who had briefly sat on a corridor floor with her in January. He took Lily to the park. He cooked pasta on Sundays. He had dinner with Victoria on Friday evenings, alternating between the Vietnamese place and a Thai place he'd found, and, once, a dinner at her apartment that she'd cooked herself with the focused determination of someone who had decided to learn something and was not going to do it halfway. The food was good. He told her it was good. She said she knew it needed more acid, and he agreed that it did, and they talked about food for an hour, and he thought, this is what it's supposed to feel like. In May, on a Saturday, he brought Lily. He'd told Lily ahead of time, not with a speech, but with a simple, honest, Lily-sized explanation. There was someone he liked who wanted to meet her, if that was okay. Lily had regarded him for a long moment with those dark, serious eyes, then said, "Is she nice?" "I think so. Does she like elephants?" "I genuinely don't know. Ask her before she comes." He had texted Victoria. "Important question. Do you like elephants?" She had texted back 3 minutes later. "I have strong feelings in favor of elephants." "Why?" He had texted, "Important screening process. You passed." They met at the park. Lily arrived holding Gerald, which Ethan understood as a statement of intent she was bringing her most important person to assess this situation. Victoria arrived wearing no version of her work clothes and carrying a yellow kite she'd apparently bought on the way, for reasons he didn't ask about because it seemed like exactly the right instinct. Lily looked at the kite. Lily looked at Victoria. "That's yellow," Lily said. "I know," Victoria said. Yellow seemed right. Lily extended Gerald. "This is Gerald. He has a button eye." Victoria crouched down to Lily's level, which not everyone did, and looked at Gerald with seriousness. "This one." Lily pointed. "Daddy sewed it." "It's a brown button, but Gerald was fine with brown." "Gerald has good taste," Victoria said. "Brown is an underrated color." Lily considered this for a long moment. Then, "Do you want to fly the kite?" "I was hoping you'd ask." They flew the kite for 2 hours. Ethan stood back and watched, mostly the tall woman and the small child, running across the grass with a yellow kite lifting above them against the blue May sky, and he felt something in him that he didn't have a word for. Not relief exactly, not happiness exactly, something larger and quieter than either of those things. The feeling of a door opening into a room you hadn't known was there. At some point, Lily looked up at Victoria and asked, with the directness of a 4-year-old, "Are you going to stay?" Victoria looked at Ethan across the grass. He looked back. "I'd like to," Victoria said, "if that's okay with you." Lily thought about this. Gerald was under her arm. The kite string was in her hand. The sky was very blue above them. "Okay," she said. And then, because she was who she was. But Gerald has to agree too. Victoria looked at the elephant with great seriousness. "Gerald," she said, "what do you think?" Lily lifted Gerald, looked at his button eye, and appeared to receive some internal transmission. "He says yes," she reported. "But he wants to come to dinner sometimes." "Gerald is always welcome at dinner," Victoria said. The wedding was small, as he'd wanted, and she'd agreed. December. Light snow. They held it in a room with tall windows and a view of the lake, which in winter was silver and still, and the snowfall outside was the quiet, vertical kind that accumulated on every surface and made the world look like something that had been set down gently. 22 people, the ones who mattered. Marcus, standing too straight in a suit he'd bought specifically for this occasion and would probably never wear again. Margaret Holt, who had pressed her good blue dress and brought the mystery novel she'd been reading the night of their first dinner. As a private joke she'd explained only to Lily. Ron Garrett from building management, who'd been surprised to be invited and who came anyway, standing near the back with the quiet decency of a man who knew his role in a story without needing to be told. Lily carried flowers, yellow ones, because that was obvious, and wore a white dress with a blue sash that she had insisted on, and a pair of shoes she'd practiced walking in for 3 days. Gerald, slightly battered now, rode in the inner pocket of Ethan's jacket. This had been Lily's specific requirement, and he had not argued. Margaret Holt sat in the front row and cried quietly and happily. Marcus, who had been best man on the technical grounds that there was no one else even close, spent most of the ceremony looking like a man trying not to cry while also trying to look like a man who would never cry, and achieving neither. Ethan stood at the front of the room and watched Victoria walk toward him down the narrow aisle between chairs. And he looked at her the way he had been looking at her for months, now, directly, fully, without calculation or caution, with everything he had. She saw him seeing her. She smiled the crooked, surprised one. The real one. He smiled back. He thought about a night in January, snow driving sideways off the lake, a 42nd floor corridor. A question. "Why won't you look at me?" He thought about a yellow kite against a blue sky, a drawing of a man in gray standing at the top of a building, a 4-year-old's theory of importance. He thought about how for years he had kept his eyes down and his world tight because the alternative had felt like a ledge he couldn't afford to stand on. He thought about every morning he had walked into that building and made himself small by choice, and how the smallness had felt like protection when it was really just a kind of grief dressed up in practical clothes. He thought about Lily asking whether important people worked in his building, and drawing him at the top of it in gray crayon, surrounded by snowflakes, because she already knew the answer. He thought about how the ledge had turned out to be the floor. Victoria reached him. He took her hands. They were warm. They had always been warm. Even on the coldest nights he'd noticed this about her early, that she ran warm, that the cold of the city didn't seem to reach her the way it reached him. He had teased her about it once, and she had said, without particular modesty, "I generate my own heat." He had laughed out loud, genuinely, which she'd seemed to find more satisfying than the compliment itself. He thought about that now. He squeezed her hands. She squeezed back. Outside, the snow kept falling quiet and purposeful, accumulating on ledges and window frames, wrapping the city in something white and still. Lily stood beside him and held her flowers and watched with the serious attention she gave to all important things. She had Gerald in her coat pocket, his button eye just visible at the edge of the fabric, and she had her yellow flowers. And she had the expression she wore when she was deciding whether something was right. She looked up at Ethan once, briefly, and he looked back down at her. And something passed between them, the specific, wordless communication of two people who had been a team long enough to not need the words. She nodded, once, and Ethan Cole, who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of disappearing, stood in the light and was seen. For the first time in his life, being seen didn't cost him everything. It gave him everything.